You know, family dinners are a lot easier when everyone at the table remembers what century they're living in, my daughter-in-law Claire said with a laugh as she reached for the salad bowl. A few people chuckled softly. Someone avoided eye contact. My son Daniel smiled at his plate. And I sat there exactly as I had for the last 7 years, quiet, composed, and invisible. I'm Margaret Whitmore. I'm 71 years old, a retired elementary school teacher from Ohio, and for a long time, I believed silence was another word for grace. I used to think enduring little insults was simply part of growing older. You learn to let things go. You forgive. You keep showing up because family is family. But there comes a moment when silence no longer protects peace. It only protects the people who hurt you. That Sunday evening looked like every other family dinner. The dining room glowed with warm light from the chandelier Daniel and Claire had picked out when they remodeled their house 3 years ago. The table was beautifully set. Cloth napkins folded neatly. White candles flickering in glass holders. The smell of rosemary chicken drifted through the air. On the surface, it was the kind of evening that belonged in a magazine spread about modern American families. But I had learned long ago that appearances were skilled liars. I adjusted the sleeve of my navy cardigan and reached for my water glass. My wedding ring was no longer there. It had been 4 years since my husband, Richard, passed away. 43 years of marriage reduced to photographs in silver frames and memories that arrived unexpectedly, like the scent of cedar after rain. Richard had always filled a room with quiet steadiness. After he was gone, the world did not become louder. It became emptier. Across the table sat my granddaughter Emily, now 16, her long blonde hair tucked behind one ear as she scrolled through something on her phone. Every so often she glanced at me with a kindness that reminded me painfully of her grandfather. Beside her, Claire continued speaking. Honestly, I don't know how previous generations survived without Google. Imagine making life decisions based on newspaper advice. Another laugh drifted around the table. I recognized the pattern. The comments were never direct enough to challenge. Never cruel enough for anyone else to call out. Just small enough to hide behind humor. Death by 1,000 paper cuts. Daniel poured himself iced tea. Mom always says handwritten letters solve everything, he joked lightly. More laughter. My fingers tightened slightly around my glass. Handwritten letters. Richard and I had exchanged them for decades. Even after email became common. Especially after his diagnosis. I still kept every letter in a cedar chest upstairs in my bedroom. Funny how memories become old-fashioned when the people who cherish them are no longer here to defend them. Grandma's just traditional, Claire added with a smile that never reached her eyes. Very traditional. The room grew warm. Or perhaps it was only me. I looked around the table. Family photographs lined the far wall. Daniel's college graduation. Emily's 5th birthday. A beach trip from years ago when Richard was still alive. I had been there for every milestone. Every school play. Every scraped knee. Every late-night phone call. I had babysat when money was tight. Written checks when emergencies happened. Brought casseroles after difficult weeks. And yet somehow, at this table, I had slowly become a guest in the very family I helped build. Emily suddenly looked up from her phone. Her eyes moved from her mother to me. The smile on her face faded. For a moment, no one spoke. The candles flickered quietly between us. And in that silence, I had the strange feeling that something was about to change. I didn't know it then, but that dinner would become the last one where I stayed silent. After dinner that evening, I drove home through the quiet streets of Columbus with the radio turned off. The sky had already darkened, and the streetlights cast long shadows across the pavement. Autumn had settled over Ohio early that year. The trees along Maple Avenue glowed in shades of amber and crimson, beautiful in the way endings often are. I pulled into my driveway and sat in the car for a moment longer than usual. The house looked exactly as it always had. White shutters. A small front porch. The flower bed Richard built for me nearly 20 years ago. Nothing had changed. And yet everything had. Inside, the silence greeted me the way it always did. Not unkindly. Just honestly. I hung my coat by the door and walked into the kitchen. The clock above the stove read 8:47 p.m. I still kept it 5 minutes fast because Richard used to joke that I worried too much about being late. Some habits survive grief. I opened the refrigerator and saw the blueberry pie I had baked that morning. Emily loved blueberry pie. I had packed slices for everyone after dinner, but there had been little room for conversation between jokes and polite smiles. The pie sat untouched. I closed the refrigerator gently. No sound seemed right in an empty house. I poured myself a cup of chamomile tea and carried it to the living room. Richard's old armchair remained by the window. I had never moved it. Sometimes people asked why. I never knew how to explain that grief is not about forgetting. It is about learning how to live beside absence. The lamp beside his chair still cast the same warm light across the room. For a moment, I could almost imagine him there with a newspaper folded neatly in his lap, looking over his glasses with that quiet smile that always made me feel understood. Richard had been the kind of man who noticed things others missed. The person left out of a conversation. The child sitting alone at a party. The small sadness hidden behind practiced smiles. I often wondered what he would have said if he had witnessed those family dinners. Then again, perhaps he had noticed long before I did. I took a sip of tea and glanced toward the cedar chest near the fireplace. Inside were decades of handwritten letters. Birthday cards. Anniversary notes. Grocery lists that somehow became love letters over time. One winter after our 20th anniversary, Richard had written something that I still remembered word for word. Margaret, promise me one thing. Never make yourself smaller just to fit inside someone else's comfort. At the time, I laughed and told him he was being dramatic. I was a teacher. A mother. A wife. Making room for others was what I did best. Looking back now, I wondered if there was a difference between kindness and disappearing. The phone buzzed softly on the side table. A message from Daniel. Thanks for coming tonight, Mom. Claire did not mean anything by those comments. You know how she is. I stared at the screen for several seconds. You know how she is. Funny how those words become a shield. Not for the person being hurt. For the person doing the hurting. I typed nothing. Instead, I placed the phone face down and looked out the window. Across the street, a family was unloading groceries from their car. A little boy ran ahead carrying a bag much too heavy for him. His mother laughed and followed behind. Ordinary moments. The kind that quietly become memories. My eyes drifted back to Richard's chair. The house had grown still again. And in that stillness, memories began surfacing like old photographs floating to the surface of water. Christmas dinners. Birthday parties. Thanksgiving gatherings. Little moments I had once dismissed. Little moments that suddenly no longer felt little at all. Because sometimes you do not realize you have been fading from your own family until one day you notice that no one sees you disappear. The first memory that returned to me that night was Christmas. 3 years ago. The first Christmas after Richard passed away. Grief changes holidays in ways people do not talk about. The decorations remain the same. The lights still glow. The music still plays. But somewhere underneath it all, a chair sits empty, and everyone pretends not to notice. That year, I spent 2 days baking cinnamon rolls from my grandmother's recipe. Emily had always loved them. The house smelled of vanilla and cinnamon by sunrise. I wrapped gifts carefully and drove 40 minutes to Daniel and Claire's house through light snow. The neighborhood looked like something from a holiday card. Wreaths on every door. Children building snowmen. Warm lights shining through windows. I remember standing on their porch holding 2 casserole dishes, feeling nervous for reasons I could not explain. Claire opened the door with her usual polished smile. "Margaret, we decided to simplify Christmas this year. Just immediate family." I blinked. But I am immediate family. For a moment, something flickered across her face before disappearing. "You know what I mean." Daniel appeared behind her carrying wrapping paper. He looked surprised to see me. Truly surprised. As though someone had forgotten to tell him I was coming. "Mom, I thought Claire mentioned the change in plans." She had not. I stood there holding warm dishes while snow landed quietly on my coat sleeve. No one argued. No one invited me inside. 10 minutes later, I was back in my car with the cinnamon rolls cooling beside me. I told myself they had not meant to hurt me. Grief makes people distracted. Families change. That was what I believed then. The second memory came from Emily's 12th birthday party. I had arrived early to help decorate. Balloons covered the backyard. Streamers hung from the fence. Children laughed as they ran through sprinklers in the July heat. I spent nearly an hour arranging cupcakes because Emily liked them lined up by color. Later, when it came time for family photographs, Claire called everyone together. Immediate family first. Daniel. Claire. Emily. Even their dog was included in one picture. I waited nearby, smiling politely. Then someone suggested another photo. Cousins. Friends. Neighbors. More pictures followed. Somehow, I was never asked to step in. Not once. I remember standing under the shade of an oak tree, holding an unopened gift while the camera clicked over and over. Invisible. Again. The final memory surfaced slowly. Like a bruise you only notice after touching it. Thanksgiving 2 years ago. I had spent nearly $300 on groceries despite living on a teacher's pension. Turkey. Homemade stuffing. Sweet potato casserole. Cranberry pie. Richard always said Thanksgiving was not about food. It was about gratitude made visible. I cooked for 2 days. Cleaned every room. Set out my wedding china. The kind reserved for special occasions. An hour before dinner, my phone buzzed. A text from Claire. Change of plans. We are celebrating at our house this year. Less stress for everyone. No call. No apology. Just a message. I stared at the table set for 6 people and listened to the clock ticking in the kitchen. The candles burned anyway. I ate alone that evening. Not because there was nowhere else to go. Because somewhere deep inside me, I still believed next year would be different. Funny how hope survives long after evidence disappears. I sat in my living room that night and realized something difficult. None of those moments had been large enough to confront. Each one was small. Reasonable. Explainable. 1,000 tiny cuts hidden inside ordinary days. That was the genius of it. Cruelty rarely announces itself. Sometimes it arrives wearing manners, carrying pie, and smiling across a dinner table while quietly teaching you that your place in the family has become smaller than you ever imagined. The next morning, I woke before sunrise the way I always had during my years as a teacher. Old habits settle into the bones and refuse to leave. The house was still dark. Outside, a soft rain tapped gently against the windows. I wrapped a cardigan around my shoulders and made coffee in the same blue ceramic pot Richard had given me on our 25th anniversary. The handle had a small crack now. So did many things. Some people throw away cracked things. Richard used to say they simply had more stories to tell. I carried my coffee to the kitchen table and sat beneath the framed family photograph hanging on the wall. It had been taken 8 years ago at Lake Erie during a summer vacation. Daniel stood beside me with his arm around my shoulder. Emily was only 8 then, grinning with missing front teeth. Claire stood on the far side of the picture wearing a white sundress and a bright smile. Looking at it now, I wondered when exactly smiles had stopped meaning safety. Memory is a strange thing. It edits, protects, softens sharp edges until one day something happens, and suddenly every missing piece returns at once. I thought back to the first time Daniel introduced Claire to me. They met at a charity fundraiser in Cincinnati. Daniel called me afterward sounding happier than I had heard in years. "Mom, I think she is special." And I believed him. When Claire first entered our lives, she was charming. Thoughtful. Always asking questions. She brought flowers during holidays. Sent thank you cards after dinner. She remembered birthdays. I liked her immediately. Richard did too. "She is very polished," he once told me quietly while washing dishes after Thanksgiving. At the time, I smiled. That is not a bad thing. He dried his hands and looked toward the living room where Claire and Daniel were talking. "No. But polished things can hide cracks beneath the surface." I laughed at him then. Looking back, I wish I had listened more carefully. The first small sign came during wedding planning. Claire wanted a modern venue downtown. Daniel dreamed of marrying in the church where our family had attended for 3 generations. One afternoon, I overheard her speaking to him in the backyard. "Your mother means well, but she has old-fashioned ideas about everything." Her tone was gentle, almost affectionate. Yet something about those words lingered long after the conversation ended. Old-fashioned. It became her favorite description for me over the years. My traditions became outdated. My advice became interference. My presence became optional. The transformation happened so slowly that I barely noticed. Like watching daylight fade 1 minute at a time. After Richard passed away, things changed faster. Grief leaves empty spaces. Sometimes people fill them with kindness. Sometimes they fill them with convenience. Family dinners moved from my home to theirs because it was easier. Holiday decisions were made without asking my opinion because they did not want to burden me. Even Emily's piano recitals occasionally happened without anyone mentioning the date until afterward. There was always an explanation. Always a reason. That was the difficult part. Nothing happened loudly. No slammed doors. No cruel declarations. Just a steady erosion of belonging. I looked down at my coffee cup. The steam had faded. Outside, rain continued falling across the yard Richard once spent entire Saturdays tending with pride. He planted every rose bush himself. Red roses for anniversaries. Yellow roses because I once told him they reminded me of sunlight. Suddenly, I remembered something else. A conversation from years ago. Emily had been 10. We were baking cookies together when she asked, "Grandma, why does Mom sound different when she talks to you?" Children notice things adults pretend not to see. I had smiled and changed the subject. But now, sitting alone in the quiet kitchen, I realized a painful truth. The child had seen it long before I allowed myself to. And perhaps, without knowing it, she had been waiting for me to see it too. That afternoon, I drove to the grocery store for things I did not really need. A carton of milk. Fresh bread. A bag of apples. Sometimes errands are not about groceries. Sometimes they are about reminding yourself that the world is still moving. The parking lot was crowded with parents rushing after work and retirees comparing produce prices. Ordinary life unfolding around me. I had always loved that about America. No matter what happened in your own little corner of the world, somewhere nearby someone was buying flowers or picking out birthday candles. Life kept going. I was reaching for a loaf of wheat bread when I heard a familiar voice behind me. "Grandma?" I turned and found Emily standing there in her school sweatshirt, her backpack hanging from one shoulder. Her eyes widened in surprise. "I did not know you came here on Wednesdays." I smiled. I suppose after 40 years in the same neighborhood, habits become permanent. She laughed softly and stepped closer. There was something different about her expression. Less like a child. More like someone carrying thoughts too heavy for her age. "Mom sent me to grab a few things for dinner," she said. Then her smile faded. "Do you have a minute?" We ended up sitting at a small table near the store's coffee corner. Outside, people pushed carts beneath gray autumn skies. Emily stirred her hot chocolate without taking a sip. "Grandma, can I ask you something?" I nodded. "Of course." She hesitated. "Are you happy when you come over for dinner?" The question caught me off guard. Children often ask the questions adults avoid. I folded my hands around my coffee cup. "Why would you ask that?" Emily looked down. "Because sometimes you look sad after Mom makes jokes. And Dad never says anything." Her voice was quiet. Careful. The way people speak when they are afraid of hurting someone they love. I felt my chest tighten. Not from pain exactly. Recognition. "Your mother probably does not mean any harm," I said automatically. The words came out before I even thought about them. Emily lifted her eyes. They were so much like Richard's. Clear. Observant. Honest. "Grandma," she said gently, "you always defend everyone." I had no answer for that. Because she was right. I always had. Teachers learn early to smooth conflicts. Mothers learn to carry burdens quietly. Wives learn that peace often requires sacrifice. But somewhere along the way, I had forgotten that sacrifice without limits becomes erasure. Emily took a deep breath. "I hear things sometimes." My heart skipped. "What things?" She looked uncomfortable. "Last month Mom said family dinners would be easier if they did not have to work around your feelings." The words landed softly. Somehow that made them hurt more. "She said that?" Emily nodded reluctantly. Dad did not agree. But he did not disagree either. Silence settled between us. Outside the window, a father lifted his little daughter into a shopping cart. She laughed as though the world had never disappointed anyone. I looked down at my coffee. The surface had gone still. "Grandma," Emily said carefully, "I do not think people realize how much you have done for all of us." I almost smiled. Children think adults forget. The truth is, we remember everything. We simply stop expecting acknowledgement. There are acts of love that leave no receipts. No photographs. No applause. The years spent helping with homework. The nights babysitting so young parents could rest. The checks quietly written when finances grew tight. Love often happens in small invisible ways. Before we left, Emily reached across the table and squeezed my hand. Such a simple gesture. Such a powerful one. As I drove home later that afternoon, groceries in the back seat and rain beginning to fall again, I realized something important. For years, I had convinced myself that perhaps I was imagining things. That I was too sensitive. Too old-fashioned. Too emotional. But children notice truth before adults learn to hide from it. And for the first time in a very long time, I no longer felt completely alone. That evening, I pulled the cedar chest closer to my armchair for the first time in years. Dust had gathered lightly along its edges. Not enough to show neglect. Just enough to show time. I ran my fingers across the worn brass latch and opened it slowly. Inside lay decades of a life built one ordinary day at a time. Birthday cards. Photographs. Letters tied neatly with faded ribbons. The past does not disappear. It waits quietly until we are ready to look at it again. I lifted a stack of papers and found an envelope labeled in Richard's careful handwriting. House documents. My chest tightened unexpectedly. Richard had always been organized. The kind of man who filed tax records in color-coded folders and kept instruction manuals long after appliances had been replaced. I smiled despite myself. Some people leave behind money. Others leave behind order. I opened the envelope and began sorting through papers beneath the warm light of the lamp. Mortgage statements. Insurance policies. Receipts from home repairs. Then I stopped. There it was. A copy of the cashier's check we had written 12 years earlier. $100,000. The down payment for Daniel and Claire's home. I stared at the number for several seconds. I had almost forgotten. Not because it was small. Because parents rarely keep score. Richard and I had spent nearly 30 years saving carefully. Vacations close to home. Second-hand furniture when money was tight. Extra tutoring after school. Summer classes. Little sacrifices added together over decades. When Daniel and Claire were newly married, housing prices had risen faster than expected. They worried they would never afford a home in a good neighborhood with quality schools for future children. I still remembered the night they sat at our dining room table discussing it. Daniel looked exhausted. Claire looked worried. Richard and I exchanged a glance. We did not even need words. We had always spoken fluently in silence. The following week, we gave them the money. No loans. No contracts. No conditions. Just love. One day you will do the same for your children, Richard told Daniel at the time. Daniel cried that evening. He hugged us both and promised never to forget what family meant. Funny how memory changes when life becomes comfortable. I kept searching through the chest. More documents surfaced. Checks written quietly over the years. College savings contributions for Emily. Emergency payments when Daniel lost his job during the recession. Hospital bills after Claire's surgery years ago. I had forgotten some of these myself. Not because they lacked importance. Because love given freely does not demand applause. I sat back in the chair and looked around the room. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked steadily. Tick. 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 Time measures many things. Years. Seasons. And sometimes distance between people. A soft knock interrupted my thoughts. I opened the front door and found my neighbor, Helen Parker, standing on the porch carrying a small casserole dish covered in foil. Helen had lived next door for nearly 20 years. Widowed before I was. Strong in ways that rarely made noise. Made too much chicken casserole again, she said with a grin. We both knew that was not true. Food is how some people say, I see you. We sat in the kitchen drinking tea while rain tapped gently against the windows. After listening quietly, Helen folded her hands and looked directly at me. Margaret, may I ask you something? I nodded. When was the last time someone in that family asked how you were doing and truly waited for the answer? I opened my mouth. Then closed it. Because I could not remember. Not one moment. Not one conversation. The realization settled over me with surprising calm. Not anger. Not bitterness. Clarity. Sometimes the hardest truths arrive softly. Before leaving, Helen squeezed my shoulder. You taught children for 40 years. You spent your life helping others find their voice. Maybe it is time you remembered your own. After she left, I stood alone in the quiet kitchen. Her words lingered long after the front door closed. Outside, autumn rain continued falling across the neighborhood. Inside, for the first time in years, I stopped asking myself whether I deserved better, and began asking why I had accepted less for so long. The invitation arrived 3 days later in the form of a family group message. Claire had a talent for making announcements sound cheerful and efficient at the same time. Sunday dinner at our house this week. We are celebrating Emily making honor roll. 6 o'clock. Looking forward to seeing everyone. Attached was a smiling photo of Emily holding her certificate. My heart warmed immediately. Emily had always worked hard. Richard used to say she inherited my patience and his stubbornness. A good combination if life is kind. An even better one if it is not. I stared at the message for a long moment before typing a reply. Congratulations, sweetheart. Grandpa would be so proud of you. Emily responded first with a red heart. Daniel added a thumbs up. Claire reacted with a smile. Strange how entire relationships can fit inside tiny symbols on a screen. Sunday arrived cool and clear. The kind of autumn afternoon that made Ohio look like a painting. Golden leaves drifted across sidewalks. The air carried the scent of wood smoke from distant fireplaces. I stood in my bedroom deciding what to wear longer than I cared to admit. Finally, I chose a deep green dress Richard always liked. Not because anyone else would notice. Because I would. Some acts of dignity happen in private. Before leaving, I paused beside Richard's photograph on the dresser. Wish me luck, I said softly. The picture offered the same patient smile it always had. I drove the familiar route to Daniel's house as the sun began lowering behind the trees. The neighborhood looked peaceful. Children rode bicycles near the corner. A dog barked in the distance. Ordinary scenes. The kind that remind you life rarely announces its turning points. Most life-changing moments begin like any other day. The dining room was already full when I arrived. Claire's sister and brother-in-law had come. A few family friends too. Laughter floated through the house. The table had been decorated beautifully with small pumpkins and candles. Claire excelled at creating lovely environments. That had never been the problem. Margaret, Claire said brightly as she greeted me at the door. You made it. Such an odd phrase. As though my presence remained uncertain despite years of showing up. Emily hugged me tightly. Grandma, you came. I smiled into her hair. There was never any question. During dinner, conversation flowed easily. College applications. Football games. Rising grocery prices. The little topics families use to fill the spaces between deeper things. I listened quietly and passed dishes around the table. At one point, Emily began talking excitedly about studying literature in college. Grandma inspired me, she said with a grin. She made reading feel magical. My chest tightened with pride. Before I could respond, Claire laughed lightly and sipped her wine. Well, literature is lovely as long as you remember it is not exactly a practical career these days. A few people chuckled politely. Emily's smile faded slightly. I saw it immediately. Teachers notice these things. Grandmothers too. There is value beyond practicality, I said gently. Some things enrich life in ways money cannot measure. Claire tilted her head with that familiar smile. That sounds very nice, Margaret. But the world has changed since your generation. There it was again. Your generation. Not an opinion. A dismissal wrapped in politeness. Across the table, Daniel shifted uncomfortably. His eyes lowered toward his plate. The old silence. Reliable as winter. I looked around the room. Candles flickered softly. Conversations paused for a heartbeat. And then something unexpected happened. Emily put down her fork and looked directly at her mother. "Maybe some things did not need changing," she said quietly. The room fell still. Claire blinked in surprise. Daniel looked up. And for the first time in years, I sensed that the carefully balanced silence around this family had begun to crack. No one spoke for several seconds after Emily's words settled over the table. The candles flickered softly between serving dishes and half-filled glasses. Outside, the last light of evening stretched across the backyard in shades of amber and gold. Inside, something far older than that sunset had begun to shift. Claire laughed first. Not loudly. Not harshly. Just enough to smooth over discomfort. She had always been skilled at that. "Emily, sweetheart, I was only making conversation." Her smile remained perfectly in place. The kind of smile that photographs beautifully and reveals nothing. Emily lowered her eyes but did not take back her words. That surprised me most of all. At 16, standing firm can feel harder than standing alone. Daniel cleared his throat and reached for his water glass. "Let us not turn dinner into a debate," he said quietly. There it was again. The familiar instinct to restore peace without addressing the wound that disturbed it. I had spent years doing the same thing. Perhaps Daniel learned it from me. Perhaps that was part of the problem. Claire placed her napkin beside her plate and smiled in my direction. "Margaret knows I respect her. We simply have different views sometimes." Respect. Such an interesting word. People use it often. Yet true respect rarely needs to announce itself. I looked down at my hands resting in my lap. The hands of a 71-year-old woman tell stories if you know how to read them. Faint age spots. Slightly crooked knuckles from years of writing on classroom chalkboards and grading papers late into the night. These hands had tied shoelaces. Packed lunches. Held feverish foreheads. Signed checks. Written letters. Buried a husband. Built a life. Funny how invisible a lifetime can become when familiarity replaces gratitude. Across the table sat family friends who had known us for years. People who attended our wedding. People who watched Daniel grow up. I wondered what they saw when they looked at me. A retired teacher. A widow. A grandmother. Did anyone still see the woman who once worked 2 extra jobs so her son could attend college without crushing debt? Did anyone remember the nights Richard and I spent balancing bills at the kitchen table, choosing sacrifice over comfort because that is what parents do? Emily suddenly stood and walked toward the kitchen. "I forgot dessert plates," she said quietly. I watched her leave and felt something tighten in my chest. Not sadness. Recognition. She had inherited more than Richard's eyes. She had inherited his inability to ignore unfairness. Claire turned to one of the guests and smoothly changed the subject to college admissions and scholarship applications. Conversation slowly resumed. Laughter returned. Forks moved again. Yet something remained different. Once silence cracks, it never fits together quite the same way again. As I looked around the table, my eyes landed on a framed photograph hanging near the dining room entrance. Richard holding a young Emily at the county fair. She could not have been older than 4. Both of them smiling as though joy were the simplest thing in the world. I remembered that day clearly. Emily had wanted a stuffed bear from one of the carnival games. Richard spent $20 trying to win it despite knowing the game was rigged. When he finally succeeded, she hugged him so tightly he nearly lost his glasses. Later that evening he told me something I have never forgotten. People remember how you make them feel long after they forget what you gave them. At the time, I thought he was speaking about kindness. Sitting there now, I realized he had also been speaking about dignity. The dinner continued. Dessert arrived. Conversations drifted from schools to weather to holiday plans. Ordinary topics. Ordinary voices. But beneath the surface, I felt a quiet certainty settling inside me. The kind that arrives after years of confusion finally give way to truth. For so long, I had mistaken endurance for virtue. I believed staying silent protected the family. But silence had protected something else entirely. A pattern. A habit. A version of peace that asked only one person to disappear. And as I sat beneath warm light surrounded by familiar faces, I understood something with surprising clarity. The next time the moment came, I would not disappear. 2 weeks passed before the moment arrived. Life has a curious way of giving us time after we think our decisions have already been made. The leaves outside my window turned deeper shades of gold. The mornings grew colder. I began taking longer walks through the neighborhood, noticing things I had ignored before. A neighbor planting mums on her porch. Children waiting for the school bus. The way sunlight lingered on old brick houses in late afternoon. Grief had taught me that life continues. Clarity was teaching me that it deserves to be lived fully. On Friday evening, another message appeared in the family group chat. Sunday dinner at 6. Claire had added a smiling emoji and a note about discussing holiday plans. Holiday plans. I stared at the screen for a long moment. For years, those 2 words had filled me with quiet anxiety. Which invitation would arrive late? Which tradition would disappear this time? But something had changed. Not in them. In me. Sunday came wrapped in crisp autumn air. I brought a pecan pie using Richard's favorite recipe. The same recipe I had made every Thanksgiving for nearly 40 years. When I arrived, the house buzzed with conversation. Family friends had come again. Claire greeted everyone effortlessly. Daniel looked tired. Emily smiled when she saw me and immediately moved a chair beside her own. Such a small gesture. Yet kindness often arrives quietly. Dinner unfolded much like every other dinner before it. Conversation drifted from rising costs to college applications. Football scores. Travel plans. Ordinary topics moving through an ordinary evening. Then it happened. The moment I had unknowingly been waiting for all these years. Someone complimented the pie. Margaret always makes the best desserts, Claire said with a light laugh. Honestly, some people from older generations express love through food because they do not really know what else to contribute these days. A few uncomfortable smiles appeared around the table. Not laughter this time. Something had changed there too. I looked down at my folded napkin. The room grew very still in my ears. I thought of Christmas. The empty chair beside mine after Richard died. The birthday parties. The forgotten invitations. The down payment on this very house. The letters in the cedar chest. Emily's question in the grocery store. Helen's words in my kitchen. And suddenly I realized I was no longer afraid of speaking. I placed my napkin carefully beside my plate and looked up. Claire, I said softly. My voice surprised even me. Calm. Steady. The kind of voice I once used in classrooms when something important needed saying. Every conversation stopped. You are right about one thing. My generation often expresses love through actions. The room remained silent. I continued. I expressed mine through years of babysitting. Through helping with college expenses. Through writing a $100,000 check so this family could buy this home. Through hospital bills paid quietly and dreams supported without conditions. Daniel's face went pale. Claire blinked in surprise. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse anyone. Truth rarely needs volume. For years, I believed love meant making myself smaller so others could feel comfortable. Richard taught me otherwise. It simply took me a long time to listen. My eyes moved to Daniel. Son, I never expected repayment. Parents do not keep score. But kindness should never become invisibility. Daniel lowered his gaze. For the first time in years, he looked not like a grown man avoiding discomfort, but like the little boy who once held my hand crossing the street. Emily reached for my hand beneath the table. I squeezed hers gently. Then I stood. I love this family, I said quietly. Enough to stop disappearing inside it. No one spoke as I picked up my coat. The silence that followed felt different from all the others. Not empty. Honest. Outside, the evening air was cool against my face. Behind me, the front door opened. I turned to find Daniel standing there with tears in his eyes and Emily beside him. And in that moment, I realized something beautiful. Finding your voice does not guarantee others will change. But it changes you. And sometimes, that is where healing begins.